the former president as part of this procession. That is then followed by a limo carrying President George W. Bush, his son, and his wife. That's followed by the Secret Service then, of course, and there's a couple family buses because at least 17 members of the family came with them as we watched the arrival here. Nora, and the drums don't just sound poignant here, but the picture-perfect sunset that we're looking at behind us here.
Sun is setting here in Washington, just as the most important people in Washington have come on the east front of the Capitol to say goodbye. I was downstairs and many of the senators of both parties were making their way to the Capitol Rotunda. This is a bicameral and a bipartisan welcoming ceremony. So you ran into Senator Shelby there just a few moments ago. We saw John Sununu. So many names that we've become so familiar with, past and present here in Washington. Let's listen in for a moment. So the arrival ceremony you're about to watch includes about 1,000 people. That will then be followed by a service there, which will last for about an hour, and then the president's casket will lie in state until Wednesday morning before the full service at the National Cathedral. As we mentioned, Bob Schieffer, John Dickerson, Margaret Brennan, Major Garrett. Look at that picture of our nation's capital tonight as the sun sets in more ways than one this week. It's the end of an era.
Pretty amazing to look at. Bob, talk about what goes through your mind as you watch all this.
Well, I can remember when Lyndon Johnson lay in state, and I remember my wife and I going up there that night, and Linda and Lucy, his daughters, were there shaking hands with everybody, and down through the years, Gerald Ford, I think we just said, was the last president to lay in state. And I guess we ought to, all of this is a strict protocol, and no one but a president lays in state. John McCain's casket was there, but you say, what is it, Major?
Repose.
If it's someone other than a president, they lie in repose. But you have to be a pretty cynical person not to be moved by watching and seeing the kinds of pictures that we're seeing here today. It's almost indescribable to me.
It's a reminder of the institutional importance of our country with the presidency, and that the presidency is an all-encompassing office. It is elected as a representative of one party, but the presidency is meant to serve the entire country. In moments like this, when we reflect on a president's legacy, the whole country gets a chance to take its own stock, and historians take their own stock, and the country sort of sits back and says, presidencies matter as a national institution, not strictly a partisan institution or a representative of one ideology or one political party by itself. To govern this country successfully, to govern this country in a bipartisan way, as George Herbert Walker Bush clearly did and demonstrably and organically did, you need both parties at the table and both parties in agreement. When he talked about, many years later, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which transformed the lives of 40 to 50 million Americans, he said it had to be bipartisan, or as he said, nonpartisan. That was its legacy. That's why it was durable, because so many stakeholders of both parties were involved in drafting that and seeing it implemented. That's instructive in the way to approach politics that lasts and changes things for the better.
You know, we've been talking about the family all day, and just when you see all those old former staffers, I mean, they are undoubtedly remembering those crucible moments with George Bush. I mean, during the Cold War, when real things were at stake, the fights over the budget, where and then the political campaigns, he ran in some very tough political campaigns. And all of the people gathered there at the top of the steps are no doubt reflecting back on those moments when they hadn't gotten any sleep for long periods of time, and they were there in the trenches with George Bush.
And so often people refer to HW in this one-term president in an almost as derisive way. But if you look at the period of time when he was in that presidency, along with those cabinet members that you were just talking about, the kind of experience he surrounded himself with, it was sort of the dream team foreign policy-wise. You had Brent Scowcroft, his dear friend James Baker, who was sharing those details of his passing with us yesterday. Dick Cheney was here with us on Face the Nation, and he said the country was really lucky to have him when they did. Because yes, it was just a 4-year term, but he came into that job with the inheritance knowing everything, all the risks facing the world, because he'd been vice president, because he'd been CIA director, and managed through what could have been a tremendously risky period of time at the end of the Cold War, managing that and really opening the door to America becoming the sole superpower at that time. Well,
and you remember having talked to James Baker, one of the first things that George Herbert Walker Bush did was settle accounts in Central America, quiet Nicaragua and that war which had bedeviled Ronald Reagan's presidency, and that was a platform to do other successful maintenance and stabilizing initiatives on the global stage.
You just saw George W. Bush and his wife Laura making their way to the top of the steps there. The rest of the family on those two buses then that you see behind the hearse and the vehicle that was carrying the 43rd president. And to Bob's point earlier about how rare this, yes, it is rare. It was Gerald Ford laid in state in 2006. It was Reagan before that in 2004, Nixon in 94. But before that, we hadn't seen a state funeral for a president since 1973. So it doesn't happen that often. And it is a remarkable image and process to watch play out here, especially on a day and a night and in a moment like this, Nora.
Spectacular. And the former president has chosen as his pallbearers former Navy captains, admirals, all who commanded the CVN 77 and her carrier strike group. So they are positioned at the base of the rotunda steps to be those pallbearers. And that speaks to this man who held the position of commander-in-chief, but also started his nearly 70 years in public service when he was 18 years old as a Navy pilot. 58 combat missions, nearly died, lost 2 of his crewmates, Delaney and White. That affected him for his entire life.
Which is why he didn't often talk about that service, because he was fully cognizant of the fact that 2 of his brothers died in service. And yes, it's also worth noting, as you all did earlier, that everybody looks at that video, that old tape, which the president has talked about before, of him seeing a camera when he was rescued at sea after his plane was shot down. And a lot of people look at that, and it's worth remembering also all the other missions in places and times when he put himself in danger.
That 8 millimeter footage when he was rescued by the sailors on the USS Finback.
Here's the casket the back of the hearse being opened. And we'll pause for another moment here. Hard to imagine the heavens providing a more picturesque scene here in the Capitol as we take a look at this.
That is President George W. Bush, and he is speaking there by Major General Howard, who has helped craft this entire state funeral. From beginning to end, it has been in the process for years.
So you talked about nothing less than first class all the way. The pallbearers for the 41st president's casket include an admiral, 3 vice admirals, 8 rear admirals, and the captain, who will then take that casket up the steps to a clearly emotional George W. Bush as he watches all this.
I think if I just read Laura Bush's lips, she said, "How beautiful."
We've been saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's
the sun has just about set.
Yeah.
And
it's
given the advance work that the Bush team is known for, they will have planned this to the minute.
Yeah.
So that the sun will be setting and disappear just as his casket enters the United States Capitol to lie in state. John Meacham, who is the president's biographer, and spent so much time with him. And he's speaking at the state funeral on Wednesday at the National Cathedral. He said character is destiny. Presidents don't change when they get to that office. They become more of what they are. It's the overwhelming tsunami of history does not allow you in that maelstrom to suddenly discover someone you are not.
another 21-gun salute for our 41st president, George H.W. Bush, as we watch his son look on and say goodbye. As the pallbearers bring that casket up the Capitol steps. As you mentioned, Nora, such a delicate, choreographed, exact movement. casket being preceded by the Special Honor Guard. When the casket reaches the top of the steps here, it'll be greeted by President Bush's former Vice President Dan Quayle, also James Baker, who was also the former Secretary of State, and White House Chief of Staff, who was on the plane as well, and with the President in his final moments, Andy Card, former Vice President Dick Cheney, Elizabeth Dole, Bob Gates, Colin Powell, Senator Lamar Alexander. The list of names is pretty amazing to think about. And the comment that Bob Gates made, by the way, after the president passed, regarding what he did and his stewardship of this country and this world, for that matter, when he said there's no precedent in all of history for the collapse of a heavily armed empire without a major war. He was a figure of enormous historical importance.
One of our most consequential presidents, presiding over a change of the global world order, and has been remarked, did not spike the football with the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think his life, I'm touched by this because it's extraordinary to see this. And I'm also just reminded about the nobility of service to one's country. And I wonder if that's a lost ideal in some ways. And so for all of us to pause and remember about the deep sacrifice that our men and women in the military make, to have a commander-in-chief who has served and honored that. He is the last president to have served in combat.
As John Dickerson, President George W. Bush watches the casket of George H.W. Bush pass by him.
It's just, you can see, I mean, the Bushes make fun of that they're a family of criers. I was at a funeral once, and George Herbert Walker Bush, eulogizing his friend Hugh Sidey, the former journalist, broke down, and it was a sign of the deep friendships he had. And so his son, it's got to be just overwhelmingly emotional watching this beautiful tribute at the beginning of this ceremony.
And we heard from James Baker yesterday when he was recounting those final moments that he was there for with the former president, that 40 minutes before he passed, in those final moments when he was calling all of his children, the very last phrase was to Bush 43, to the former president, George W., saying, "I love you too."
And this is the most, in my opinion, beautiful building in all of America, the nation's capital. I've worked in the Capitol, I've worked at the White House. The White House is impressive, it has a grandeur, but I think the Capitol is the most beautiful building in all of America. Its architecture speaks to the world about its lofty aspirations, its high ideals, and those who work in it love and revere it for that reason. And George Bush is returning to the place where he started his political career, as a member of the House of Representatives, elected in 1966. Lying in the rotunda is close to his political origins as a member of the House, first and foremost, and serving in government in many other capacities. I got a note from Tom McMillan, a Democrat from Maryland who was in Congress during Bush's presidency. And he recounts the story, February 26, 1991. He's in the House gym. President Bush was in the House gym because he retained his House gym privileges, even as president. He's playing... That is to say, Tom McMillan is in the gym. He notices on CNN that Saddam Hussein has surrendered. He knows President Bush is in the sauna, and he wrote me a note where he says, By then, President Bush was in the sauna with his buddies. I turned to the Secret Service agents and asked if the president knew about this development, and they told me to tell him the good news. So I opened the door of the sauna. With the steam blocking my view, I said to the president that I had just heard that the war was over. He said, "Tom, that is truly great news, and thanks for letting me know. I've wondered how often one has had the opportunity to tell a president that a war is over." That was told to the President of the United States in the House gym by a Democrat who he had knew and had a good relationship with. That in itself is a kind of illustrative story about George H.W. Bush, his relationship with the House, and his bipartisanship.
And look at this from the dome of the Capitol looking down now. This is where the body will lie in state. You know, the part that I find so reassuring about this is its sameness. We do this the same way. In the same way we vote our presidents in, they take the oath, they pledge to defend the Constitution. There are no oaths to people, but to the Constitution. And this is just one of the ceremonies that forms the foundation of our government. And to me, that's the part that I feel good about.
The ritualistic fabric of American political life.
It's hard not to feel good about the country when you watch all of this happen this afternoon, while we also remember his service.
But as George W. Bush said, my father taught me that the office of the presidency is more important than the man who occupies it. He said it was one of the most important things his father taught him, and that whoever occupies that office should bring honor to that office. And we should point out that the Lincoln catafalque right there, Bob, as you mentioned, what's the same? That's the same since 1865, built to support Lincoln's casket. And if you come and visit this beautiful building, as Major mentioned, you can see the catafalque. It's held down in the basement and you can walk by and see it, or you can visit in the next day or two and see President George Herbert Walker Bush lying in state.
Before the public is invited, though, what we're about to watch here is the service that you're about to watch. You'll hear the invocation remarks from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Will speak. Paul Ryan, the outgoing Speaker of the House, will speak. The Vice President will then speak. You'll see America the Beautiful performed by the U.S. Naval Academy Glee Club. Laying of wreaths by the Senate Majority and Minority Leaders, a laying of wreath by the House Speaker, a laying of wreath by the Vice President, another performance by the Glee Club, and then benediction. When all that is finished this evening, there'll be an organized departure from the rotunda, and then the public viewing begins tonight at 7:30. And again, we'll run through Wednesday morning. Let's pause again here.
Ceremonial at ease.
Margaret Brennan remains in our studio there. Margaret, you spoke to James Baker yesterday about some of the president's final moments. I wonder if you can talk about that for a moment.
James Baker, of course, people know him from all the illustrative titles, esteemed titles he held, but he put himself forward to talk as just the best friend of the 41st president yesterday, spoke in very personal terms, saying it was a very peaceful passing. He described it as very peaceful, gentle, he said. He was by his side, walked into the room a few times that day and said to him, Jefe, which is what he called him, Chief, you're going to heaven. And they talked through, he said, with his wife and with the kids, had some final moments. And it was a good 40 minutes before he passed, from his final words until that final breath. And he said it was a very gentle passing. And it's important to hear, I think, from that personal level from James Baker, because you hear time and again with the presidency how isolating it is. And the 41st president had by his side one of his very best friends running his political campaigns, advising him on some of the most staggering issues of global threats and imbalances. And to his final moments, that's who was there rubbing his feet and saying his goodbyes.
George H.W. Bush's first son, eldest son, George W. Bush, watches really welled up with emotion as his brother, his wife, and then his brother stand next to him, and Jeb Bush's wife, Columba.
Vice President Quayle is there, and he said...
You don't see him much anymore, a lot,
yeah.
But you do here tonight.
He said our 41st president was the most honorable, decent, and capable of gentlemen, as close to the ideal of the office as anyone in our lifetimes.
Vice President Pence, members of the Supreme Court there as well. We saw Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
We give you thanks, Almighty God, for the appearance among us of great men and women who serve as inspirations for all Americans to be their best in service to God, country, and neighbor. This day, we honor our 41st President, George H.W. Bush. President Bush dedicated his entire life to public service as a vocation, first in the military, then as a member of Congress, a diplomat, director of the CIA, vice president, and finally, president. It is a record of service reminiscent of John Quincy Adams and unmatched in nearly a century. We thank you, O God, for having endowed President Bush with noblesse oblige, and ask that his example of service to others might be an inspiration to all Americans, indeed to all the world. As we continue this celebration of honor, grant that all who attend to these proceedings might be desirous of being our best selves in service to all our brothers and sisters, as you might call us to be. Dear Lord, thank you for inspiring such greatness in President George H.W. Bush and continue to bless the United States of America. Amen.